Welcome to the Author Interviews for Liberty Matters, a forum of various authors and texts available on the Online Library of Liberty. The Online Library of Liberty is part of the Liberty Fund network of websites. For more information about Liberty Fund, visit our webpage at www.libertyfund.org. I'm Pat Lynch, a senior fellow at the Liberty Fund, and today I'm joined by Joseph Pastel, who has written one of the response essays for our December 2020 forum on A.V. Dicey. If you'd like to watch any of the other interviews by the authors in the forum or any of the other interviews in the series, please visit our YouTube channel. A link to the forum itself on the Online Library of Liberty is also available on our YouTube channel. Joseph Pastel is an associate professor of politics at Hillsdale College. His research focuses primarily on regulation, administrative law, and the administrative state. He is the author of Bureaucracy in America, the Administrative State's Challenge to Constitutional Government, published by the University of Missouri Press in 2017. He has written various scholarly articles on bureaucracies and administration, and he's also contributed numerous articles to Liberty Fund's site, Law and Liberty. Joe, thanks for taking the time out of your schedule to do this interview as part of the Liberty Matters Forum.
It's great to be with you.
Well, it's been a very interesting forum, and as I've told everyone who has done the interview, we ended up being pretty timely on a number of levels, discussing rule of law and discussing a lot of the things related to immunity for government officials, but also how government officials act under the law has just recently become a little bit more relevant in various ways. Your essay is interesting in that you begin by talking about some of the distinctions between where sovereignty lies in the British system, in the Parliament, and in the American system. Now, this is a question that a number of the authors have discussed, but I was wondering if you could take a few minutes to walk our viewers through the differences between where that sovereignty lies, how that affects the way we think about immunity for government officials, and how it actually makes significant differences between the system in the UK and the American system.
Sure. So this was something I think maybe the most critical thing for us to take away from Judge Glock's initial essay was that A.V. Dicey is cited by a lot of people who today, I guess, are called anti-administrativists or skeptics of the administrative state as having this sort of fundamental criticism of the administrative state, that Dicey is a thinker who rejects the whole of the administrative state. And so we who are skeptical of administrative law or the administrative state would line up with Dicey. And so Judge Glock basically points out that that Dicey was a Brit who believed in the principle of legislative supremacy, that the British Parliament was the sovereign power in the British system, and therefore that the British Parliament could delegate its powers to whatever bodies that it wanted to. It could transfer the power to make rules or to make law to other administrative agencies. And that's really the central question that skeptics of administrative law or administrative power have focused on in America, that question of the delegation of lawmaking power, of rulemaking power to administrative agencies. And Glock points out that the British system allows that to a much greater extent than the American system, right? In America, the people are the sovereign. They vest the power in the legislature, and so the legislature can't further delegate its lawmaking power. This is, again, one thing that's very timely about Judge Glock's initial essay was that he calls us to maybe focus a little less on the delegation of legislative power to agencies and a little bit more on the rule of law problems that the administrative state presents, particularly in this area of qualified immunity for officers. And so I think that is one of the reasons why we should all read that initial essay and really think about Dicey in this new light that Judge Glock is presenting him in.
It's interesting when I think about this, the evolution of the two systems, both during Dicey's lifetime and today. So when Dicey was writing, the British judicial system was much less powerful than the American judicial system. And the British judicial system is growing, or at least wants to grow in some authority. And I'm wondering how that affected the way that he viewed the role that the courts should play in judging government officials.
Yeah, so it's interesting how Dicey would maybe differ from somebody who's a little bit more of a judicial, I guess, supremacist is probably the wrong word here, but somebody like a Justice Gorsuch who really believes in very powerful judicial review administrative agencies. Dicey says a lot of the same things that you hear echoed by modern sort of advocates of judicial review. But of course, he's working in a very different system. And it does seem that in the British system, there's a much starker problem of the overlap between the executive and the judicial branches, right? That the courts are in some ways produced by the monarchy, they're agents of the crown. And so this, of course, Dicey was well aware of this struggle between the courts and the crown. Um, and I think he probably would have maybe been a little bit less strident than some people today in America because of that tension in the British system. Whereas in our constitutional system, the courts are clearly independent of the chief executive in ways that make it much more reliable, I think, as checks on administrative power.
One of the things in your essay that you highlight is that in the 19th century, number one, the courts really did handle the administrative piece that is today handled more by bureaucracies. And that number two, a citizen's interaction with the government was more likely to happen through the courts. Um, can you talk a little bit about how that worked? Because to a reader in the 21st century, that seems, I don't want to say strange, but it seems like a foreign idea, number one, that the courts would have that role. And secondly, that a citizen's first interaction would be with a court. Is that because the state was so much smaller, or is that because the role of the courts was just so much more expansive?
Right. So this is the thing that puzzled me when I did all of my historical research on bureaucracy in America in the 19th century, is that I couldn't really wrap my mind around it in the way you suggest. Or, even today, I still have trouble wrapping my mind around the notion that administrative agencies didn't really exist in the same way back then, and that courts perform the functions that administrative agencies perform today. Um, Part of the reason that this was the case was because a lot of this happened at the state and local levels. So in many cases, and Alexis de Tocqueville actually describes this quite nicely in passages that are often overlooked. You have somebody like a town selectman or a justice of the peace who's kind of both a judicial officer and a regulatory officer all at once. But typically, also, these cases would be referred to courts that would have to decide between parties about things like, assessments for property for the purposes of tax and so forth. And so the courts were, especially at the local and state levels, they were the only administrative body that existed, and they made a lot of the day-to-day decisions that determined how government was going to function. This isn't quite how it worked at the federal level. But again, most of the regulatory power in the 19th century was exercised at the state and local levels because the police power was still held by the states. So um, it seems that there were almost two different worlds: the state and local world, in which the courts were essentially the bureaucrats, and then the federal administrative world, in which there were administrative agencies, but the courts still engaged in quite a bit of judicial review over the decisions of those agencies. And one of the things I tried to contribute to this conversation, this forum, was to show that Dicey's concerns were broader even than officer liability. He was really concerned about the decline of judicial review completely. Um, and that was something that was happening in both America and in Great Britain. That decline from a much more robust sense of judicial review in the 19th century to where we had gone in the 20th.
So can you give our viewers a sense as to what sorts of policy areas judges were making administrative decisions that today would be handled by state level bureaucracies or state level administrators?
Yeah, so um, from the historical accounts we have, it's the day-to-day administration that you would expect some town manager to do. So laying out the roads, assessing taxes, things that, again, we often think are executive in nature. The courts were often involved in these sorts of decisions. Now, this varied significantly by state. So the state where you see this most prominently is Massachusetts, where essentially the Court of General Sessions at the county level, these county courts were essentially also the administrative bodies. They were the county level governments. It seems that in the southern states, you had more of like sheriffs, constables, and so forth, where there was this differentiation of executive and judicial power. So that the whole story of this in the 19th century has never been fully explored or written, where somebody could go through each state and sort of show how the administration works differently in each state. So this wasn't uniform throughout all of the states, but it certainly was uniform enough that we could describe it as a system of judicial administration.
And I guess I have to ask this because I'm curious, and because I assume our viewers are curious. How did it work? I mean, I guess what I'm saying is not how did it work functionally, but was it effective? Was it a system in which those who had judicial power were effective administrators? Were there potential conflicts? Was it a system that functioned? And I'm not necessarily saying compared to today, which is obviously a very different context, but was it a system where by and large there was acceptance of it, and that the functioning seemed to be, uh, I can't say effective, but did it work?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that, of course, depends on how you would evaluate the defined work. But my view is that it functioned quite effectively, and for the following reasons. First, it made sure that power was locally accountable. Often these people were actually elected.
Mm-hmm.
So even though they were judges, they were, town selectmen, justices of the peace were still elected. And so, how you administered these decisions, how you administered these laws, would often be determined by what the opinions were of the people who had political power locally in your community. So this is why Tocqueville describes the whole system as one of administrative decentralization, as opposed to today where we have a significant degree of centralization, that administrative power comes into a community and tells it how to behave and tells it what it's going to look like without that kind of local accountability and local knowledge. Another way in which it worked, I think, or was functional, was that it relied on incentives that I think, from our point of view today, we look at as corruption or sort of unseemly, but that were actually quite effective incentives. So administrators had, and this gets back to the point actually of immunity. Administrators had skin in the game. They often relied upon enforcement for their own salaries or their own funding. The other aspect of this that's not quite fully understood is that there were informers, private actors who would tell on their fellow citizens in order to claim part of the penalty for some of these kinds of regulations if they were violated. And so the system, again, from our point of view, it looks a little bit like corruption, or it looks like it's unprofessional from the point of view of a technocratic bureaucracy. But it relied on incentives that in some ways worked on a daily basis, on a day-to-day level. People, people were engaged in their communities. People understood what was happening in their communities. They had control over what was happening in their communities. And so those were the virtues, I suppose, of the system, even if it had the downsides that we could obviously draw out of this sort of an approach.
So I'm thinking about George Washington Plunkett's famous phrase, "I seen my opportunities and I took them."
Mm-hmm.
So basically, we see is machine politics, particularly at the local level, and a changing demographic, is that the natural evolution from a system in which judges and those in law enforcement have skin in the game, and therefore they've seen more opportunities because of the changing nature of the rents that are available? Or is that corruption a different animal in your view?
I mean, I do think in some ways they do go together. The famous formulation a political scientist Stephen Skowronek used to describe the 19th century is that it's a state of courts and parties, that there's no bureaucracy in the 19th century, but it's basically these two institutions: political parties, which we associate with machine politics, and courts, which I'm suggesting actually aren't that far away from machine politics either. And we loathe machine politics in a certain sense in the 21st century because we see its lack of professionalism and routinization of decisions. But those are the things about bureaucracy also that have downsides as well. And the 19th century approach at least avoided those downsides.
So it seems to me there are two sets of risks that you're talking about. On the one hand, if you do revert to a system or talk about a system like a 19th century system, you've got corruption as a possibility, and you've got individuals who have incentives to act in ways that might not seem wholly public spirited. But now we've switched to an entirely different set of incentives in which the problems are very different, right? Where those making those decisions are insulated from political accountability. We've got more expertise, quote unquote, but that creates an entirely different set of outcomes, and there's a bigger set of problems. And I wanted to transition to your mention of Chevron. Actually, you really are the only, well, it's mentioned, but you go into it in a little bit more detail. Can you explain for our viewers exactly what Chevron is and exactly how it fundamentally changes the relationship between the courts and administration of the law?
Sure. So the Chevron doctrine was, until about 10 years ago, I would say, this sort of arcane principle of administrative law that nobody paid attention to, but has now become quite
Yeah.
important, quite politically salient. But the basic idea is that reviewing courts, a court that's reviewing an agency's decision, will defer to any reasonable agency interpretation of a statute or of a law. It could be the uh, other sources of law. So basically, that agencies, when they interpret the law, get deference from courts. Now, this seems to fly in the face of what a court is supposed to do, right? Courts are supposed to actually interpret law. And so to say they will defer to agencies that are interpreting law seems to abdicate the judicial function, which is one reason why there are so many critics of Chevron. But it also seems to disrupt the balance of power between courts and agencies by making agencies not only the arbiters of their policies, but also the arbiters of the laws that authorize them to make policies. And I do think Dicey and the sort of 19th century American approach to administration would both counsel against a robust Chevron doctrine. One of the famous formulations in Dicey's rule of law principle is that people are subject to the ordinary courts or subject to the law of the land when they are acting in an official capacity. That legal liability and judicial review are always present when a person is acting as an administrator. And Chevron seems to say judicial review is present, but it's a deferential form of review that isn't really judicial review like we would have had in an ideal world.
I guess a lot of this relates back to the role of increasing role of what we'll call expertise, or at least specialization. Maybe specialization is a better way of putting it, in the administration of governance. And of course, this begins in the early part of the 20th century through the progressives. And I was so. I guess it really depends on the way you view the problem, right? You could make kind of, we talk about type 1 and type 2 errors, right? So I know this isn't a perfect analogy, but just let me kind of work through it here. So on the one hand, you've got the corruption problem and the incentive issue in the 19th century model, and you do have individuals who perhaps don't have the same policy expertise, or there might be a set of incentives that might lead them to decisions that are not necessarily in the public interest, whatever that may be. But now you've kind of moved the problem today in a very different direction. Which one, in your view, particularly in the context of the two periods, is the greater risk right now? Is the greater risk that corruption piece, or is the greater risk the insulation piece, along with the lack of accountability?
Yeah, I tend to think it's the latter, that the risk of administrators being completely removed from the daily lives of those people they are ruling is a fundamental problem in a Republican form of government that you have to try to avoid. There might be ways of sort of balancing out, finding some, this might not be a binary problem so much as it could be like a problem of a spectrum. And so there might be ways of balancing out the risks on the other side. Certainly we have communication, transportation capacities that would allow us to have more expertise, even if we decentralize these decisions like they did in the 19th century. So I don't know if you have to choose all one problem or all the other, but I still think if you do have to be concerned about both of these problems, the problem of insulation is a really much more serious problem than the problem of corruption. We can never seem to get rid of corruption. It seems like the more we try to do it, the worse it gets. And so maybe a bit more of a sort of realistic approach to that question would enable us to recapture some of the benefits of an accountable administration, while also, sort of accepting at least a small amount of corruption as just inevitable, regardless of which path we take.
So that's a very deep insight that corruption is inevitable. I'm afraid you're not the first person to come up with it, but it's an important one. And I do think that it takes me back to something Michael Greaves said. His view is that the problem really with all of this, and I've come to believe that perhaps he's got a point here, is just the expansion of state power generally. That it really is kind of unfeasible when the state is large and has an interest in so many, or a perceived interest in so many different policy areas, that inevitably you're going to go beyond the scope of a judicial, the ability of a judiciary to oversee it, and so you move towards a professionalized bureaucracy, and then you move towards something like Chevron, and that's just an inevitable outcome of the growth of the state. I mean, is what you're talking about here just the mere difference between what the state was responsible for in the 19th century and what the state is responsible for today? And I mean that nationally, locally, and state.
Yeah. So I think there's something, I think Grieva is right about this, that, and it seems just the efficiency as a result of greater capacity, technological, so forth. It just seems like it's given the state an opportunity to do more and to organize itself in order to do more. And that has put strain on all of these traditional institutions. On the other hand, I suppose the counter argument to this, which I think is worth taking very seriously, is that state and local power in the 19th century was actually very, very robust. The system of regulation at the state and local level in the 19th century was pretty pervasive. In fact, more pervasive in some ways than it is today. Sort of billiard halls and puppet shows, and all taverns and inns and ferries had to be licensed very carefully. So there was a pretty serious state capacity, and the state had entrenched on a lot of things that we might have thought were privately dealt with in the 19th century. It was just decentralized. And so maybe it's not so much the growth of state power as it's this new form that it takes, this centralized administrative form, that is the problem. I don't know if I can come down firmly on either side of that, but I see the arguments on both sides, that it's not just about the amount of state power, but where that power resides now that is the real question.
So you make an interesting point, because we do tend to idealize the 19th century as this period of circumspect government. But you're absolutely right. It really was about having a more limited national government, and that the local and state governments, I would still argue that local governments, state governments have more capacity today and more responsibility today, but it's a lot more expansive. And that's what happens with machine politics, right? Machine politics really trades on the ability to sell jobs to people who are going to support the campaign, and be able to, have certain businesses that will allow voters to get organized to support those political interests, and those interests need to have some lever over them, and so it tends to be underplayed. Let's talk a little bit. Let's turn back a little bit to how we might talk about returning to a Diceian model of immunity, or re-examining immunity for government officials. Is that going to be something that the legislatures ultimately have to handle, or is this something that the courts have to handle, or is it something that where the two institutions have to work together to try to change?
Yeah, I think it's probably something both institutions have to take steps to change. I'd be interested in watching your interview with Professor Grieva on this, and I'm sure that you and Judge Glock also discussed this. Sort of the steps away from officer liability or towards officer immunity. Some of those steps were taken by courts, making sort of carving out exemptions from doctrines that that granted access to courts, and some of it was done by statutes as well. So I think both institutions would be responsible for reversing the trend, since both institutions have been largely responsible for producing it.
But which institution, or does either institution have an incentive to move us back towards a system of a smaller government in which you have greater accountability towards or greater accountability of the officials that are executing its laws?
Oh, that is a good question, and I think in that sense the answer is very clear. It's the courts that would have the incentives for returning us to some more common law grounded approach. The problem is, and I'm sure I'm not the first one to say this, is that the courts, the bench and the bar, are trained in law schools that don't think very highly of the common law anymore. And really, Dicey's argument is an argument to try to ground our system in the common law. It's been a long time since we've had that view of common law be sort of in the mainstream of legal training in this country. But I think if you go back and you look at who lost power as a result of the transfer of power to the bureaucracy, it was the courts, it was the judiciary. And at the time that this happened in the early 20th century, it was the courts who spoke up most forcefully in saying, this is a new turn in American law, and we're going to resist it because we see these things as being our job. So in a way, if you could recapture that way of thinking in the judiciary, it would be clear that the courts would actually have some incentives to reclaim those powers. But as it stands now, it seems like they're going to want to avoid that.
But you'd almost have to retrain judges to be city planners, city transit officials, health officials. You'd need them to have an entirely different set of skill set, wouldn't you? Or is it just that we're overstating the extent to which these kinds of expertise and this kind of professionalism are really necessary to govern.
I mean, there's a lot of controversy about that question. So in the areas where courts have tried to play administrators, and there are quite a few of them in this prisons, school systems, right? Courts have tried to, yeah. So courts have thought of themselves as city administrators in these contexts, and it's gone very badly. You know, some political scientists point out the institutional incapacity of courts to gather information. Right, they're prone to just thinking about whatever the parties bring to them. They don't actually get to go out and investigate a problem. They have to think in terms of binaries, the parties, in the case, as opposed to what's good for the public. So there are serious institutional capacity problems with saying courts should reclaim some of these things. On the other hand, I still like to think of courts as central to our political system and as useful checks on administrative power. And so I don't want to give up on courts just because they fail to do the right thing sometimes. But I admit that it is a serious practical problem.
Well, if you did it on the state level, as you point out, you've at least got judges who are elected, who are accountable by election, and so that's something that bureaucrats are not currently, and you really would have a more effective lever if, in fact, voters were informed in that way, which is another question for another forum. So, Joe, I want to thank you very much for taking time out of your day to sit down and talk with us here at the Author Interviews. Thank you for a very provocative essay, and thanks again for your participation.
Glad to be here.
Thank you.
Thanks.